Hi, it's Tammy with Shabby Fabrics. I have a beautiful, warm, cozy flannel quilt behind me. This is a Batting Buddy template quilt. This is part 3, using the Batting Buddy template. And so what we did on this one is I decided half square triangles are always fun. I love the way that they make the quilt have motion. The other thing that I did differently on this quilt is I wanted to finish it differently. I love a finished edge on a rag quilt. It seems that putting a finished edge on a rag quilt can sometimes be a trick. So I have a binding on this one. Yeah, it's a binding. I know it looks really thick. We took a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to explain how I did that and show you how wide you cut your strips and how exactly I got that to work. It's super easy, and I hope you're going to stay tuned for that. That will be at the end. In the beginning, I'm going to show you how we did our half square triangles. We did start with a pre-cut. I'm starting with 10-inch squares of flannel. This is the Maywood Studios Woolies Flannel by Bonnie Sullivan. We do have some kits available on this. However, if you're not seeing any kits available by the time that you see this video, that's not a problem. You can just buy 10-inch squares of flannel and you can easily run with that, or you can even cut 10-inch squares of your own flannel at home if you have a large stash, as I know some of you probably do. So we're starting with 10-inch squares. These are beautiful. So I'm going to show you some tips on how to do this accurately and easily, because I know making a flannel quilt can be repetitious. I'm going to show you a couple of little tricks that we learned up in the sewing room while we were making this, so stay tuned. All right, so let's get started and let's look at how we started with our half square triangles. All right, so I started with 2 complementary half square triangles. I put my oranges together. I'm going to set one aside. I'm going to turn one wrong side up. I'm going to use a Creative Grids seam guide. Now, we've used seam guides in the past. However, this one's very long. This one is 15 inches. The other one we use a lot is 9 inches. It will not reach corner to corner on this. That's why I've got this big one on set with me. All right, so this seam guide has a small marks in each of these corners. You know what that mark is? Center. It tells me exactly where the center of this is. So when I lay this down on my square, I can make sure that this center mark is exactly in the point. This one's exactly in the point, and I know right now my seam guide is going to take an exact 1/2 inch marks out of the middle, because normally to make a half square triangle, you're going to draw a line corner to corner. Then you have to find your 1/4 inch on either side. That's sometimes difficult to do. I don't like not knowing where that 1/4 inch is, so we generally will use seam guides. So I'm going to show you how this works. So I'm going to take a friction pen and I'm just simply going to mark on one side of my seam guide. I'm going to rotate my mat and I'm going to draw the line on the other side. So what I've just done is I have drawn a sewing line now. Not a cutting line, a sewing line. I layer 2 squares, right sides together, just like this. And if you want, you can put a couple of pins in there. Now I have the Gypsy Quilter cool pins on set with me. I like them because they're heavier than the fine patchwork pins. I found sometimes when working with flannel, it's a little heavier and sometimes it can be difficult to work with, or your pins are going to bend. All right, so you would take this to the machine and you would stitch right on those lines. Now I did that one ahead of time. So you see I stitched right on those lines. I did use a gray thread. All right, so now I'm going to take a regular ruler And I'm going to take the 1/4 inch mark on my 2.5 by 12.5 and put that right on my seam line. So I know I'm cutting exactly in the center of my block, just like that. Okay? All right, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take it to my iron. I'm going to heat this seam up, and I'm going to press this open. Why am I pressing this open? Well, this is flannel, and for flannel, we find to distribute the bulk away from the seams as best you can. Opening a seam just makes so much more sense. That's why I'm going to open these seams. All right, let me do the other one because I need 2. And we're going to make, I'm going to show you how we mark now with our Batting Buddy template and where that now comes into play. Okay, so my seams are pressed open. So now I'm going to take my Batting Buddy template. Let me turn that over. All right. This template is in 2 pieces. It's in two pieces to it. The center is to cut your batting, which we'll do in just a minute. I'll set that aside. But right now I'm going to work with the outside frame of this. This outside frame is exactly 9.5 inches. So I'm going to put this on my square. You can see I still have to trim a little bit off of here. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a friction pen and I'm going to mark points here, here. See, I'm marking the 4 corners and I'm putting a good mark there because I want that mark to be visible because those are start and stop points for sewing later on. So I definitely need to have this mark visible. Okay, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this. I'm going to trim this all the way around. So I'm definitely using a spinning mat. This is the rotating mat by Creative Grids that I've got. One of my favorite mats. Right around the template, just like that. I didn't trim a lot away, but it did trim down. Okay. All right. So now I have my squares marked with my 4 dots, right? It's trimmed to exactly 9.5. All right. So now let's talk about batting. So I have on set with me just some scrap batting that we have left over from quilting quilts. I'm sure we all have batting laying around. This is Quilter's Dream batting that we're using today. And I can take 8 layers of batting. Is what I have right here. This is why I have a 60mm rotary cutter on set with me. The 60mm blade is deeper than the 45 because it's larger and it will cut through many more layers. So I'm going to use the center portion just like this. Okay, I'm going to center this on and make sure I have all my layers. Looks good to me. Here we go. Let's cut some batting. You can see you can cut through a lot of layers very quickly and easily. There we go. And just like that, I have 8 pieces of perfectly cut batting. That's clever. All right, so now I have 2 half square triangles. One of them I have marked my points on. Right here, you can clearly see that I've marked those 4 points. This one's going to go on the top. The other one that I did not mark is going to go on the bottom. All right, So I'm going to turn this wrong side up. And I have my seam running from the top left to the lower right. I'm going to take my Batting Buddy template. I'm going to place it on this square. And I'm going to take a piece of batting. I'm going to set it in the middle. I'm going to lift my template off. What that does is it perfectly sets my batting in the center of this square. That's amazing, right? I have exactly 1 inch all the way around. That is perfect. Next, I'm going to take my square that has the marks. Now I need to place this on here with these seam allowances going in the opposite direction. This is a trick that we learned in the sewing room. When I was sewing these together, I went, oh, I see a very clever way to get around marking all of these. You're going to like this tip. So this seam is now going opposite, just like this, okay? Perfect. I'm going to take my cool pins. Now I know that I'm going to start in the upper corner and I'm going to sew to this corner. So I'm going to put a pin where I'm sewing, where I'm starting, and where I'm ending, because I already know these corners are going to walk away from them. I already know it because this is flannel. We all know flannel just kind of has a mind of its own sometimes, right? Okay, so let's take this to the machine. I'm going to start sewing in this upper corner, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch all the way off of this. All right, let's go do that. All right, so when I'm going to start sewing right here on a corner like this, I'm going to use a starter strip because I already know some machines do not like to start sewing on a corner. We're just going to sew onto a strip just like that. Now it's like I'm chain sewing right now, and it's a lot easier for me to grab a hold of this starter strip and just give it a little pull if I need to get this to stitch onto this corner. The other thing I'm doing is I'm reducing my stitch length to 2.15. So I'm sewing with a smaller stitch length than what my machine defaults to. All right, now I'm just going to stitch all the way along right in the ditch. And I'm just going to take my hands and just gently pull this apart a little bit so that that seam or that ditch is more apparent. All right, so we're just going to open it up just a little bit like that. And straight off. Okay, now I need to sew the other side of this, right? But guess what? When I flip this over, do you see how now my ditch runs the opposite direction? So now I simply turn it over and repeat. There we go. All right, so let's clip off our starter strip. So by flipping this over and sewing on this seam allowance, just stitching in the ditch on this side, I have quilted a perfect X, and I did not mark one mark on this block to do that. Now, if you're doing the black blocks, that's a different story, right? So what I did is I used a Clover water-soluble pencil. There's white, there's pink, there's blue. Pick your favorite color. I have pink on set with me today, but when you mark this, you can see that we did mark this. I think the camera can pick that up. You see that we marked that before we did sew that. The other thing I have, a lot of us have a Clover chalk marker, and it is just simply chalk in here. It's loose chalk, and it has a little wheel with little teeth on it. And when you run this across the fabric, and I'm just going to do this, I want you to see this. You see how it leaves a mark? Just like that. The problem with chalk is it will brush away. Now it leaves a very faint mark, but be careful if you're using chalk. If you're stacking your blocks one on top of each other, getting ready to go to the sewing machine, be careful that your chalk is not all brushing away and getting caught on all the other flannel that you have going on, all right? Flannel that's stacked on top of each other, all right? So that's why I used the Clover pencil. And this is water soluble. So when you wash this quilt to the end, you're gonna wash all these marks right out of it, okay? All right, so we have our black blocks, we have our colored block. Now, let's talk about putting these blocks together. Remember how I said in the beginning where I'm going to finish this quilt a little bit differently. We're gonna put binding on this quilt. So on the other rag quilts, when we start doing our rows, especially, this only applies to your first row and your last row, what I'm going to tell you. You're going to actually start sewing the very top of this raw edge, back stitching, and come all the way down to this mark and back stitch. That's for the first row. For the very last row that you put together, you're gonna start at this mark, back stitch, and sew completely to the edge and back stitch there, all right? Why am I doing that? Well, when I put these together and you have your 1-inch seam allowance at the top like this, I don't want this big gap all around the outside edge of the quilt, right? I need those all attached because I'm putting binding on that and I'm stitching on that. If I was just going to rag this and just clip it, that's fine that they're not sewn together. But if you're putting binding on, you need to make sure that all along your edges, you are stitching all the way to the end to enclose this so that when you open this up to do your binding, you have, these pieces are hooked together, okay? So let's go ahead and go do that really quick. I'm gonna go ahead and take this to the machine. I'm gonna show you how you do this. I'm going to use my cool pins because now I'm pinning through 4 layers of flannel plus 2 layers of batting, and that is a hefty amount to be pinning through. All right, so I'm going to take a 1-inch seam allowance. We'll talk about where that 1 inch is, so I'll see you there. So on my stitch plate here, I have a 1/4 inch, I have 3/8, I have 4/8, which is 1/2 inch, 5/8 is marked, 6/8, 7/8, 8/8. 8/8 is 1 inch. So I'm going to use this very outside mark for my guide on this machine, for my seam allowance, right there. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. All right, but I have to remember, I have to stop at my mark right here and do a back tack. Just like that. All right, so let's see what we've got. So it's very strange to have this large seam allowance coming to the top, but that's because you did it right. So now, when I open this up, you can see how this is sewn together right here? This is row 1, and I need that to be just like that. This is still open down here at the other side. That's because this is going to attach to another row. All right? So let me grab what I have done ahead of time here. Okay. So you can see how I have these seam allowances are stitched together at the top, but here we have stopped on the mark right here when we sewed that together. Same thing here. Now, when we put our rows together, how do we do that? Well, I have a raw edge out here, remember, that's going to be there. Remember how I said all the way around you have to close those. So here we are again. This has been stitched together, but I did do the stop right here in this corner. Stop, stop on the black one. But see, when we did the teal one, we started here, sewed all the way to the edge. So you can see all the way around my edge, I have that finished mark. See, I have those finished seams so that I can do binding on that. Here's the bottom. The bottom row, when you put that on, you start here and stitch all the way off of this so that this is solid here. This is sewn together, but it is not sewn together here in the center. Now, why do they leave that like that? Well, I'm going to show you. That comes when we start clipping it. Before we clip it though, we're going to actually put the binding on it because I don't want to have a bunch of pieces flying everywhere trying to put the binding on this quilt. So we took 1/4 of an inch all the way around to finish this. You see that? All the way around, and I just laid these seams open and sewed straight across them. This flattened those right out. Okay, let me grab my binding. Okay, here's my binding. What I did was I cut a 4-inch strip, just like this. Folded in half. We pieced them all together, and I think I do have 2 pieces here. I have a couple pieces here. We just used a straight seam to do this. Okay, press your seams open. All right, so let's talk about how do I put binding on a quilt like this. Well, get a little bit out of the way here. All right, so to put binding on a quilt, I'm going to leave a generous tail. All right, you can leave that tail. Doesn't matter where on the quilt you leave it. Does not matter. All right. So I'm going to start sewing right about here. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right. Now when I come to the corner, normally on a quilt, when you miter a corner, you're sewing with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and you're stopping a 1/4 of an inch before you get to the edge of your quilt to make a mitered edge. On this one, because I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I'm using a 1/2 inch stop right here when I do this binding, all right? It's easier if I show you. Let's go do that. All right, so you remember where a 1/2 inch is. It's 1 mark before 5/8. It is 4/8, which is 1/2. So we're going to start right here. I'm going to do a back tack. Back stitching is important to hang on to that binding. Here we go. All right, now I need to stop a 1/2 inch from this edge. Okay, so this is a 1/4 inch sewn all the way around the edge. This mark on my foot right here, and this is a 20D foot that I'm using on a BERNINA. I'm going to sew until this groove is even with this 1/4 inch seam allowance, because this means my needle is 1/4 of an inch from this groove. All right, let me show you. There I am right there. This is where I'm going to stop. This groove is on the 1/4 inch line. There's your 1/4 inch to your needle. 1/4 and 1/4 is a 1/2. I know I'm exactly a ½ inch from the edge. I'm going to back up and do a back stitch here and cut my thread. All right, now I'm going to turn my quilt. I'm going to take my binding and it's going to go up like this. Yep, just like that. Right here, so that this edge is even with this edge of the quilt. I'm going to bring it back down to do your miter. Just like that. I'm making sure my folded edges here are even. I'm making sure this folded edge is even with the top of my quilt. All right, now I'm going to start stitching again, ½ inch seam allowance, and I'm actually going to start right on the edge of that. So I started right at the top, just like that. All right, so I'm not sewing this whole thing on. I just need to show you how to do a corner, and I think I can do that with what I've got here. I'm going to take my pins out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to my ironing board. All right, so I'm going to take my iron and I'm actually going to press this seam. I want to press my binding away from the quilt. This is going to make it much easier when we turn this binding and when you come back and stitch it. Okay. Now I can turn this to the back just like this. Okay, I'm going to take my Wonder Clips now. Just grab a few of them. And I can see my seam right here where I sewed that. So I want this binding to completely cover that seam, that stitching line. We're going to completely cover it. Why is that important? Well, when I sew this from the front, I'm going to move that binding aside and stitch in the ditch right next to that binding. So I know if that's where I sewed the binding on at, I know that other stitch is going to be very close to there. So I need to make sure that binding completely covers that edge. That way, when I sew this on, I can be assured that I have completely caught my binding with a machine stitch here. I'm just going to do a little bit of this. Let's pop our corner. So I'm going to fold this like this and back down on itself. There it is. Look at that perfect miter right there. Let's look and see what it looks like on the other side. Look, perfect miter. Boom, right in the corner, right where I want it. Excellent. All right, that's how we're going to do this. I'm going to put one more clip on this. Just like that. All right, now we're going to go back to the machine, and now I'm going to show you how I top stitch this. All right, look how pretty that looks from the side. I love this look. All right, so I'm going to start right here, and I'm just going to stitch right in the ditch, right along that binding. Let's go do that. All right, now normally I would be using black thread. I'm using silver thread on purpose so that you can see where I'm sewing, all right? But if I were, when I made that quilt, I used black binding on that, or black thread, excuse me, not silver, because I wanted my thread to blend into my binding. So you can see how I'm pushing with my index finger. I am pushing this binding over like this to expose that stitch in the ditch seam right there. Right, I can get right next to where I stitched that on. Right into the corner, needle down, turn, and go, keep going. Just like that. Okay, you get the idea. Let's go trim this out. Let's see how we did first. All right, so I started here. Where's my little scissors at? I started here and sewed to over here. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, that is perfect. So you can see my stitches right here. You see how I caught that binding perfectly like I wanted to. That looks amazing. If I had black thread in there, you would never see it and you'd never know that I had machine stitched that binding. The front of the quilt, you can't see my stitches because they're hidden. The flannel just kind of relaxes back onto that seam. You never even see your stitches from the front. Okay, now we're ready to finish this quilt, and then we go throw it in the wash, and that is when the magic happens. I prefer the Fiskars Action Scissors. I love these rag quilt scissors. They've got a spring in here. It springs back in my hand. So it's very little motion to close them, but then the open is it just opens immediately for you. So it's very fast and easy to use these. If you prefer regular scissors, we do have the Kai rag quilting scissors that also work very well. These have very nice blades on them. They're very sharp, and they're made for cutting through multiple layers of flannel. So when I do this, my first cut, let's do this one. My first cut on this is about 1/2 inch away from this. And I'm going to cut them both. There we go, so that I can bring this up together. All right. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to cut this corner out of the middle. Remember how we left these corners? I'm going to go ahead and cut those out of there, just like this. I'm going to cut a couple of these. So I'm removing all of this excess bulk in the center right here. Here and here. There we go. Okay, so now you can see when my 4 sides all come together, I don't have all the bulk that you do over here. It's much cleaner. All right, now I'm ready to cut. So I'm going to cut both at the same time, and you can cut every 1/2 inch, you can cut every 1/4 inch. That's entirely up to you. We cut about every 1/2 inch. It does not have to be a perfect 1/2 inch though, just like that. See that? All right, throw it in the washing machine and wash it. I washed this on a cycle that had like heavy soil in it, so it really washed it well. When you take it out of your washing machine, take it immediately outside and shake it, and that's going to get a bunch of threads off of it right there. Into the dryer, I used a couple of bath towels in there and some of those dryer balls. I have like 4 dryer balls I threw in there with it. They just kind of all bounce around and just kind of get it all nice and fluffy. Stop it after about 10-15 minutes. Clean your dryer vent because it is going to be completely full of lint. Clean that, put it back in, and go. All right? Dry it until it's dry. And then again, when I took it out and I shook it outside in my yard one more time. The birds love it. They've got all these cute little threads they can now use to build their nests with. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you learned some tips and tricks on how to do a beautiful finish on a rag quilt. I love this binding. I love the way this looks. I love the finished look that it gives our quilt. It's just kind of got a border on it, but it's that heavy, nice binding that's just going to stay there for years and endure washing after washing. I will see you again on another Shabby Fabrics tutorial.